All right, get ready, because today we're going deep on something we use every single day but probably don't think too much about. English conditionals. Like all those what-if scenarios that pop up in conversation.
Yeah, it's amazing how much these simple what ifs really tell us about how we think and especially how we communicate in English.
Exactly. And we're using a really fun episode from an English learning podcast today as our source material. And get this, it's not just about boring grammar rules. Think of this deep dive as getting a secret decoder ring for how native speakers express all kinds of things.
Mhm.
Possibilities, advice, even humor.
It really is like a secret language inside the language,
Yeah.
and understanding it can help you avoid all sorts of misunderstandings, especially in social situations.
Okay, here's a little teaser from the podcast that totally hooked me. They said that English speakers mess up conditionals all the time, but by the end of this deep dive, you'll be way ahead of the game.
That's the beauty of getting into these little details, right? It's like you gain the superpower to communicate better and understand people on a whole other level.
Okay, so they start the podcast with this hilarious example of a teenage girl imagining how her dad would react if she even mentioned going on a trip. She says he'd totally freak out. I mean, can you relate to that?
Oh, absolutely. That example perfectly shows how conditionals can express strong emotions. Think about it. She's not saying he will freak out, just that he would in this, hypothetical situation, maybe even a forbidden one. It's like this extra layer of urgency, like there are potential consequences.
For sure. It's like a warning built into the grammar.
Yeah.
Mom definitely had her own freak out mode too. But you know what else the podcast talks about? Conditionals in those really delicate social situations, like when you're trying to ask someone out.
Yeah,
Yeah.
it's so important. The way you phrase that invitation can totally change things. I mean, does it sound like a date or just hanging out? In English, those lines can get so blurry. So, yeah, understanding how to use conditionals the right way can definitely save you from some awkward moments.
Right. The podcast really breaks down the subtle ways you can phrase those invitations, like whether you say, would you like to, versus if you're free. It's like a whole secret language for flirting.
It is, and it shows how conditionals aren't just about what's possible, but about what someone wants to happen and how we handle social expectations.
So let's get into the actual grammar for a bit. The podcast spends a lot of time on those unreal situations, like when you daydream about winning the lottery. They explain how those sentences are structured, and there's this weird thing about using were instead of was sometimes.
Ah, yes. That's where we get into the fascinating world of the subjunctive mood. It might sound intimidating, but really it's just a way of talking about things that aren't facts, just possibilities or wishes. And using were is a sign that we're talking about something hypothetical, something unlikely.
Wow, it's like English has this secret code hidden in the grammar. So it's not about the past tense at all, like I always thought, but about how likely something is.
Exactly. It's this incredible tool for expressing all these subtle shades of meaning. We can change the verb a little bit, and suddenly we're talking about a whole range of possibilities, things that might happen or might not.
That's so cool. It's like English has this built-in system for how much we believe in something. I'm
Yeah.
already starting to see conditionals everywhere.
I bet. You'll be surprised how much you start to notice them once you know what to look for. Have you ever really thought about this whole were versus was thing before? Most people use it right without even realizing it.
To be honest,
Yeah.
not really. I guess it's one of those things you pick up just by hearing it a lot. But now that you mention it, it's like a light bulb went off.
That's what I love about it. You start to see the patterns and it's like you unlock this secret code. It makes you appreciate how complex language can be, right?
Definitely. Okay, so we've got these wild, unreal situations. But the podcast also talked about everyday things, like if it rains tomorrow, we'll stay inside. They pointed out that we use the present tense with will in these cases. What's the difference there?
Great question. That shift in tense is all about how probable something is. Remember how we talked about how English can show how likely we think something is? Well, when we use the present tense with will, we're saying the event is more realistic, more likely to happen.
So it's like a spectrum of possibilities, right?
Yeah.
The were structure is for these far out scenarios. And as we move towards the present tense, it's like things get more and more real, more likely to actually happen.
Precisely. It's English's way of saying, hey, this might actually occur, so pay attention.
I love that. It's like English has its own built-in weather forecast for how likely things are. It's making me see sentences in a whole new way.
That's just the beginning. The more you explore conditionals, the more you'll find these subtle distinctions and all the ways you can use them to express yourself.
I can't wait. And speaking of possibilities, the podcast gives these really helpful examples for putting this all into practice. Like, they want to make sure their listeners can use this conditional magic themselves.
What's really cool is how the examples show all the tiny differences in meaning that come with using different conditional structures. It's not just about getting the grammar right, but about picking the perfect way to say what you really mean, the exact feeling.
Yeah, it's like choosing the perfect shade of blue to paint a picture, right? You've got so many options and they all make a different impact.
Exactly. And that's where communication becomes an art. What about you? How would you use these structures in different situations? Like, how would you ask someone for something, give advice, or imagine a what-if scenario?
That's a great challenge for our listeners. It's one thing to understand the idea, but actually using it is where the real learning happens.
Totally agree. As you start trying out these conditionals, you'll see how much they add to your communication, making it more expressive and full of those subtle meanings.
It's like you suddenly notice this whole hidden level of meaning in normal conversations.
Exactly. And the more you pay attention to how people use those little if words, the more you start to get them. Their hopes, their anxieties, their whole way of seeing things.
Right. Like if someone says, if I had $1 million, I'd travel the world. Well, that tells me they value experiences, adventure.
Exactly. Or someone might say, if I were in your shoes, I'd focus on my career first. And that suggests they value ambition. Maybe they have a different idea about work-life balance.
It's almost like conditionals are this secret way to understand people's real motivations.
Yeah, in a way they are. They give us this unique look into how people think and what they really care about.
Okay, before we finish up, I wanted to mention one last thing from the podcast. They really pushed listeners to not just understand the rules, but to actually go out and use conditionals in their own conversations.
Yeah, that's where it all comes together. It's one thing to think about a sentence in your head, but it's a whole different challenge to use it naturally when you're talking to someone.
Totally. They even had this fun challenge for listeners to come up with the weirdest conditional questions they could think of and post them on the podcast website.
Yeah.
It's a cool way to play with the language and get creative.
Absolutely. Learning a language should be fun and engaging. And by making a space where people can experiment, it takes away some of the fear, right?
So what's the main takeaway for our listeners today?
I think the most important thing to remember is that English conditionals are so much more than just grammar rules. They're a powerful way to express yourself, connect with people, and even understand the world better.
It's like learning a secret language within English.
Exactly. And anyone can learn it. With some practice and a little curiosity, you'll be surprised how quickly you can master this nuanced way of communicating.
One thing that really struck me from the podcast was how they emphasized the importance of context when it comes to conditionals. It's not just about the grammar, but about understanding the situation and who you're talking to. You know,
That's so important. The same conditional sentence can mean totally different things depending on who you're talking to and what's going on. For example, imagine saying, if you're free later, we could grab coffee. That could be a casual thing to say to a friend, or a subtle hint to someone you're interested in, or even a polite way to brush someone off.
wow, you're right. It's like a chameleon sentence that changes depending on who it's talking to. I never realized how much meaning those little conditionals could have.
Yeah, it's really fascinating. And that's why really mastering conditionals goes beyond memorizing the rules. It's about developing a sense of the unspoken stuff, the
Yeah.
social cues, and how people use language.
So it's like a secret lesson in social intelligence hidden inside a grammar lesson.
Exactly. And the more you pick up on these subtle signals, the more confident and smooth you'll become in social situations.
I love that. The podcast also gets into some cool vocabulary around conditionals. Phrases like ask someone out, freak out, even have someone committed. I like how they explain not just the dictionary definitions, but how these phrases are used in real conversations.
That's really important, especially for people learning English. They might not know all the everyday phrases that native speakers use all the time. So understanding these phrases adds a whole new level of depth and fluency.
Yeah, and they pointed out how some of these phrases, like have someone committed, can be tricky. They can have different meanings, right? It could be about sending someone to a mental hospital, which is obviously a serious thing,
Yeah.
or it could just be a way to express frustration.
Right. It's a good reminder that language changes, right? What might have been okay to say in the past might be offensive today. So it's crucial to be aware of those shifts in meaning.
So it's not just about learning the rules, but about staying up to date and being culturally sensitive. It's like language is this living, changing thing that you always have to pay attention to.
Absolutely, and that's what makes it so fascinating to study. It's not just a bunch of rules. It's a way of communicating that shows how complex people are.
I feel like a language detective.
Yeah.
The podcast really emphasized the importance of practicing. They wanted their listeners to actually try using conditionals in their own conversations, not just understand the rules.
Yeah, that's where the magic happens. You can analyze a sentence all you want, but it's a whole other thing to use it in real life. It takes courage and a willingness to experiment.
I like how they even challenged their listeners to come up with their own weirdest conditional questions and post them on the podcast website. It creates a space where people can play with language and learn together.
That's a great way to do it. Learning works best when it's collaborative and engaging. Having a community makes it less scary to explore a language.
Yeah, it's like we're all on this journey together, figuring out the mysteries of English conditionals.
Exactly. And the more we practice, the more confident and expressive we become.
It's like you suddenly see this whole other layer of meaning in everything people say.
Right. And the more you listen for those if words, the more you learn about people, like what they hope for, what worries them, their whole outlook.
I know what you mean. Okay, so to wrap up this whole deep dive, what's the most important thing for our listeners to remember?
The biggest takeaway for me is that English conditionals, they're not just some grammar rule in a textbook. They give us a window into how people actually think, how they make decisions, how they see the world.
Yeah, it's like they add this extra layer to how we talk to each other. More flavor, more depth.
Exactly. And the better you understand all that, the better you'll be at communicating your own ideas and really connecting with people.
Okay, so here's our challenge to you, listener. Go out there and start noticing how people use conditionals. You'll be surprised by what you pick up on.
It's like becoming a detective for language, right? Finding these little clues about the people around you.
I love that. Well, thanks for joining us on this deep dive into the world of English conditionals.
It's been fun exploring this with you. And remember, learning about language never really stops.
So true. Until next time, keep asking those what-if questions and keep discovering the power of language.